January 1944. Somewhere behind the frozen hedgerows of northern France. The engine is cold now. Steam no longer rises from the radiator. Mud clings to the tires in heavy, uneven clumps, still carrying the shape of a road that led nowhere. An American Jeep sits abandoned at the edge of a shell-scarred field, its olive paint dulled by winter and war. German soldiers stand around it in silence. Not tank commanders, not infantrymen, engineers. They move slowly. One kneels to inspect the suspension. Another opens the hood, tracing fuel lines with gloved fingers. There is no armor to admire, no heavy gun, no technical brilliance meant to intimidate. And yet, the men linger. This small machine should be insignificant. Light, unprotected, almost civilian. But it isn't. Because this Jeep has already crossed beaches, forests, and bombed out roads faster than German units believed possible. It carried officers, radios, ammunition, medics. It never waited for rails. It never asked for paved roads. As the wind cuts across the field, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. This small machine represents something Germany did not build and cannot easily stop. And to understand why this realization mattered, the story must widen beyond this frozen field, to the war that produced it. By the time German engineers first encountered American Jeeps in large numbers, the war had already changed shape. The early confidence of Blitzkrieg had given way to exhaustion. In 1939 and 1940, Germany's victories in Poland, France, and the Low Countries had been driven by speed, but a specific kind of speed. Armored spearheads, rail-supported logistics, and tightly controlled operational corridors. Mobility existed, but it was centralized, heavy, structured, dependent on planning and infrastructure. By contrast, the war that unfolded after 1941 was sprawling and unforgiving. Germany now fought across 3 continents. North Africa's deserts stretched supply lines beyond Doctrine. The Eastern Front devoured vehicles faster than factories could replace them. Roads turned to mud in autumn and ice in winter, immobilizing entire divisions. Horses still pulled a significant portion of German logistics, even as the war became increasingly mechanized. This imbalance was not accidental. German military planning had always prioritized decisive operations over sustained logistical dominance. Railways were the backbone of movement. Once armies reached the railhead, mobility slowed dramatically. Fuel shortages compounded the problem. Every kilometer forward demanded calculation. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, German planners initially focused on American aircraft production and industrial tonnage. Tanks, bombers, ships. These were the visible threats. Soft-skin vehicles barely registered as decisive assets. That assumption would not survive contact. American military doctrine approached warfare differently. From the outset, U.S. planners emphasized flexibility and redundancy. Units were expected to move independently. Officers needed transport that could go anywhere, anytime, without preparation. Supply chains favored volume over efficiency, accepting waste in exchange for reliability. This philosophy extended to vehicles. Before the war, the U.S. Army issued a request for a light reconnaissance car, fast, simple, capable of off-road travel. The specifications were demanding: 4-wheel drive, lightweight frame, ability to carry men, equipment, and weapons. The solution emerged in 1941, refined rapidly under wartime pressure. By 1942, American factories were producing thousands of identical vehicles every month. By 1943, they were everywhere. In North Africa, German Afrika Korps units first encountered Jeeps in open terrain. They noticed how American patrols appeared suddenly, operated far from main roads, and vanished before heavier units could respond. Jeeps carried radios that kept units connected even when tanks lagged behind.
Medics reached wounded soldiers faster. Commanders moved without waiting for staff cars. German reports from Tunisia and Libya began to mention these vehicles, not as curiosities, but as operational irritants. In Italy, the pattern repeated. Mountain roads that should have slowed Allied advances were navigated with ease. American units bypassed predictable routes. They supplied forward positions in ways German planners had not anticipated. And yet, the full implication remained unclear. It would take the vast battles of Western Europe for German engineers to fully understand what they were seeing and why it mattered. Because behind every captured Jeep lay a deeper system, one that reshaped how armies moved, fought, and survived.
The vehicle the Germans were now examining had not emerged from brilliance in isolation. It was the product of urgency, compromise, and industrial scale. In the summer of 1940, as Europe burned, the U.S. Army issued a requirement that bordered on impossible. American planners wanted a lightweight, four-wheel drive reconnaissance vehicle delivered in weeks, not years. It had to be simple enough to be repaired in the field, strong enough to survive rough terrain, and cheap enough to be built by the tens of thousands. 3 companies responded: Bantam, Willys Overland, Ford. Bantam produced the first working prototype, but lacked manufacturing capacity. Willys delivered a powerful engine and a sturdy frame. Ford brought mass production expertise. The final design combined all 3, standardized under military specifications. The result was the Willys MB, with Ford producing nearly identical versions designated GPW. This standardization mattered. Every Jeep used the same parts. Mechanics trained once and could repair any unit. Spare components moved easily across theaters. Production lines ran without interruption. Between 1941 and 1945, more than 640,000 Jeeps were built, an output Germany could not match in any vehicle class. German light vehicles existed, but they were fragmented. Kübelwagens performed well on roads, but struggled in mud and snow. Many lacked four-wheel drive. Variants multiplied, parts differed, maintenance became complex. Fuel constraints limited usage. Most importantly, production numbers were insufficient to saturate the battlefield. American Jeeps, by contrast, were not rare. They appeared in infantry units, artillery batteries, engineer detachments, and headquarters companies. They carried machine guns, mortars, stretchers, signal equipment. When necessary, they towed anti-tank guns or light artillery pieces. They were adapted without waiting for approval. German doctrines struggled to categorize this flexibility. Captured Jeeps were sent to rear areas for examination. Technical officers documented suspension travel, axle design, weight distribution. They noted the vehicle's ability to cross terrain that immobilized heavier transports. Reports described how Jeeps allowed American units to maintain momentum even when supply routes were disrupted. The deeper concern was not the machine itself, but the system behind it. American logistics did not rely solely on rail. Roads were improved rapidly. Fuel followed units forward in bulk. Vehicles were treated as expendable tools, not irreplaceable assets. Losses were expected and absorbed without halting operations. German industry, under increasing strain from bombing and resource shortages, could not replicate this model. Each vehicle loss carried weight. Each breakdown slowed an advance or retreat. By late 1943, German engineers were no longer merely curious. They were uneasy. They understood that mobility was no longer just about tanks and trucks. It was about how quickly an army could think, react, and reposition. And the American Jeep had become the most visible expression of that difference. That realization would take on sharper edges as the fighting intensified and as German forces encountered this mobility not in isolation, but at scale.
For the German soldier at the front, the Jeep was often encountered before it was understood. A patrol would advance cautiously through hedgerows or broken villages, expecting enemy infantry to be slow, burdened, predictable. Instead, Americans appeared suddenly. Officers arrived without warning. Runners were replaced by radios mounted in open vehicles. Wounded men were gone before nightfall. German infantry diaries mention frustration more than fear. The enemy seemed to move too easily. Positions that should have been isolated were reinforced quickly. Orders arrived faster than anticipated. The battlefield felt fluid, harder to read. For many soldiers, the Jeep symbolized an enemy that never seemed tired. From a tactical standpoint, the Jeep altered tempo. American units no longer waited for supply columns to catch up. Small detachments operated independently, supported by rapid movement. Reconnaissance reached deeper. Artillery observers relocated constantly. Flanks were probed, not fixed. German tactics relied on prediction, knowing where the enemy would be tomorrow based on where they stood today. Jeeps disrupted that logic. The front became elastic. Counterattacks arrived late. Encirclements failed to close. Mobility was no longer concentrated in armored units. It was everywhere. German engineers approached the captured Jeep methodically. They measured wheel articulation, inspected the transfer case, studied how the engine balanced power and simplicity. The conclusion was consistent, nothing revolutionary, yet everything effective. The Jeep did not excel at one task. It did enough of everything, and it did so reliably. That, more than innovation, unsettled them, because it suggested a philosophy of war that prioritized adaptability over perfection, a philosophy Germany now faced across every front. And as this realization spread upward, it reached those responsible for shaping the war itself.
At the command level, the Jeep forced uncomfortable conversations. German generals had built careers on maneuver warfare, yet they now faced an opponent whose movement did not depend on decisive breakthroughs. American commanders relocated constantly, establishing temporary headquarters close to the front. Decisions were made faster, communicated faster, executed faster. Reports from the Western Front increasingly referenced enemy flexibility, not brilliance, that superior tactics, flexibility. The Jeep allowed American leadership to be present, physically and operationally, where German commanders often could not. To German intelligence officers, the Jeep became a symbol. It represented industrial abundance, standardization, an enemy unconcerned with conserving vehicles because more were always coming. Captured Jeeps were often reused by German units out of necessity, repainted and pressed into service, an unspoken acknowledgement of their utility. This borrowing was not admiration, it was survival. There was also a quieter realization. Mobility affected morale. American troops moved with confidence, knowing evacuation, resupply, and reinforcement were close. German soldiers, increasingly immobilized, felt the opposite. Retreats slowed, encirclements tightened, fatigue deepened. The Jeep did not kill. It did not dominate headlines, but it carried hope for one side and eroded it for the other. By the time German engineers finished their studies, the outcome was no longer theoretical. The war was approaching its turning point, and that turning point would arrive not with a single machine, but with thousands of them moving at once.
June 1944. Normandy. When the Allied landings began, German commanders expected chaos behind the beaches. Congestion, delays, bottlenecks. This assumption was rooted in experience. Amphibious operations were complex. Vehicles piled up, roads choked, momentum stalled. Instead, within days, something unfamiliar unfolded. American units moved inland with speed that defied expectations, not through grand armored thrusts, but through countless small movements. Jeeps flowed off the beaches almost immediately. They carried engineers marking minefields, signal units laying wire, officers coordinating scattered formations, medics pulling wounded from hedgerows under fire. Captured German reports from the first weeks after D-Day describe an enemy that, quote, recovered too quickly. Counterattacks met organized resistance sooner than planned. Positions thought isolated were already connected. Behind German lines, abandoned Jeeps accumulated. Some were damaged, others intact. Engineers were ordered to catalog them systematically. Chassis numbers noted, modifications photographed, Field improvisations studied. They saw jeeps towing anti-tank guns through mud where German half-tracks bogged down. They saw command posts appear and disappear in hours. Most unsettling was scale. This was not an elite capability, it was universal. Every American unit seemed to have mobility. Every formation carried its own momentum. German countermeasures struggled to adapt. Air attacks targeted roads, but jeeps avoided them. Artillery fire disrupted supply hubs, but decentralized movement absorbed the shock. Even when fuel shortages plagued German units, American vehicles continued to roam. By July, as the Bocage battles ground on, German engineers reported a grim conclusion. The Jeep was not a supporting asset, it was a structural advantage. And as the Allied breakout loomed, that advantage was about to be unleashed across open terrain, where speed would decide everything.
Late July 1944. Operation Cobra. When the American breakout from Normandy began, it did not unfold as German planners had envisioned. The initial bombardment shattered frontline positions, but it was what followed that proved decisive. The countryside opened. Hedgerows gave way to rolling fields, secondary roads, and open intersections. In this environment, American mobility reached full expression. Jeeps surged forward in waves, scouting routes, ferrying commanders, hauling supplies to units advancing faster than maps could be updated. German formations attempted to regroup. Orders were issued, counterthrusts planned, but coordination failed repeatedly. Units arrived late, fuel ran out, communication lines collapsed. Captured German after-action reports from August describe an enemy that did not pause. Even when resistance stiffened, American forces repositioned faster than German commanders could respond. The Jeep made this possible. It carried radios that kept artillery synchronized. It moved infantry weapons into unexpected positions. It allowed officers to command from the front rather than the rear. Attempts to counter this mobility were limited. Germany lacked the vehicles, the fuel, and the air superiority to match it. Improvised measures, roadblocks, ambushes, slowed individual columns, but failed to halt the flow. As the Falaise pocket closed, German units found themselves trapped not by tanks alone, but by speed. Retreat routes were cut, supply lines vanished, exhausted soldiers abandoned equipment they could not move. In the aftermath, German engineers submitted their final assessments. They did not blame the Jeep for defeat. They identified it as a symptom, a machine born from an industrial system, a doctrine, and a philosophy of war that valued movement above all else. By the time Allied forces raced toward the German border, the realization was complete. Mobility had become decisive, and Germany no longer possessed it. By the autumn of 1944, the consequences of American mobility were undeniable. The rapid Allied advance across France had shattered German defensive plans. Entire divisions found themselves outmaneuvered, encircled, or forced into chaotic retreats. Roads and towns once assumed secure became conduits for an enemy who moved faster than they could respond. Captured jeeps littered the countryside. German engineers continued to study them, cataloging every detail: suspension, engine, transfer case, tire design. They even attempted to reproduce certain components, but Germany's industrial infrastructure, crippled by bombings and resource shortages, could not match the speed and scale of American production. The Jeeps symbolized more than vehicles. They were evidence of a systemic advantage the Wehrmacht could not emulate. Operationally, the Jeep's impact was profound. American units maintained communication and coordination during advances the German doctrine assumed would be impossible without rail lines and heavy transport. Supplies followed forward units reliably. Medics evacuated casualties rapidly. Officers and reconnaissance parties moved freely, constantly probing and adapting.
This decentralized mobility allowed small American formations to operate almost independently, yet with complete operational cohesion, a concept Germany struggled to counter. German reports highlight a recurring theme: frustration at an enemy who always seems one step ahead. The Americans' ability to exploit gaps in German lines, bypass strong points, and sustain momentum disrupted not only tactical engagements but entire operational plans. Battles that were expected to stall extended front lines instead collapsed in days. Morale within German ranks began to erode. Soldiers saw the Jeep as a symbol of an enemy always in motion, always prepared, while their own forces were bogged down, overstretched, and increasingly reliant on rigid chains of command. The small, unarmored vehicle became a quiet instrument of psychological warfare, its presence a reminder that speed and adaptability had overtaken brute force and static doctrine. The stage was now set for the final struggles on the Western Front. As German units retreated toward the Siegfried Line and beyond, the pattern was clear. Wherever the Americans moved, the war followed, carried on the axles of a machine that Germany could not hope to match.
By late 1944 and early 1945, the full implications of the Jeep's impact extended beyond the battlefield. German forces were now in full retreat across multiple fronts. The Allies' operational mobility, enabled by the small standardized vehicles, allowed them to maintain pressure without pause. Towns were liberated faster than defensive preparations could be established. Roads once blocked by destroyed bridges or obstacles were circumvented. Even inclement weather, which had slowed previous campaigns, could not halt the Americans' momentum. German engineers, in reports sent to high command, acknowledged the fundamental difference. The Jeep was simple, rugged, and reliable. It could be repaired in the field with minimal tools and parts. It required no specialized infrastructure. A single vehicle could carry a squad, tow light artillery, or transport critical communications equipment. Multiply this capability across hundreds of thousands of units, and the result was a mobile network that Germany could neither predict nor intercept effectively. The psychological and strategic impact was equally significant. German commanders were forced into reactive positions. Retreats became disorganized as units tried to match the American speed. Supply shortages worsened because the mobility of the enemy meant that stockpiles were constantly under threat or bypassed entirely. By February 1945, as the Allies crossed the Rhine, German reports explicitly referenced the Americans' relentless flexibility, a direct acknowledgement of how critical small vehicles had become in the execution of large-scale operations. Post-war analyses confirmed the lesson. Historians noted that American tactical mobility, centered on the Jeep, allowed the U.S. Army to leverage its overwhelming industrial advantage fully. German officers reflected that even with superior tanks, artillery, and fortifications, they could not compensate for the freedom and speed that the Americans had engineered into their forces. The Jeep had reshaped the practical execution of warfare, not through firepower, but through consistent, dependable movement. As Europe's landscapes were slowly cleared of wreckage and abandoned vehicles, the legacy of the Jeep endured. Its influence on post-war doctrine was immediate. NATO armies adopted similar, light, flexible vehicles to ensure that operational speed would never again be a limiting factor. The lessons learned in 1944 and 1945 about mobility, decentralization, and the integration of simple but effective vehicles would define modern mechanized warfare for decades. The war was over, but the principle it had revealed remained. Speed, flexibility, and mobility could equalize or even surpass raw firepower.
In the end, the American Jeep was more than a vehicle. It was a quiet revolution on wheels. It carried no armor to impress, no guns to dominate, yet it transformed war itself.
Across frozen fields, muddy roads, and shattered villages, it allowed armies to move faster than maps could record, to act before the enemy could react, and to sustain operations where heavier forces would stall. For German engineers and commanders, the Jeep forced a painful realization. Mobility was not merely an auxiliary capability, it was a force multiplier, a strategic advantage woven into every decision, every movement, every moment of the battlefield. It revealed that victory could hinge not on the largest tank or the heaviest artillery, but on an army's ability to reach, respond, and adapt. Beyond tactics, beyond doctrine, the Jeep carried a lesson for humanity. Innovation is not always spectacular. Sometimes it is simple, reliable, and ubiquitous. Sometimes it is a tool that empowers the many rather than glorifies the few. And in doing so, it reshapes not just battles, but entire wars. By 1945, the war had ended, but the principle endured. Modern armies would design not for singular brilliance, but for sustained, flexible mobility. And the humble Jeep, the machine once studied in silence behind frozen hedgerows, would remain the emblem of that quiet, unstoppable power.